Thank you guys for having me. Robert kind of covered what I was going to talk about in my introduction of myself, so let's jump right in. So today we're going to talk about the origins of the thumb rest because that's really hard to find in the literature right now. And then my own neuromuscular research on what that does when we change the thumb rest and why we would do it or when we would do it or why not. And then lastly, I'm going to kind of finish up with ideas that we can use for our own playing to kind of prevent injury, hopefully, and then also things to take with you as you become a teacher in the future, which we all should be doing. Okay, so first, the origins of the thumb rest. We're going to talk a little bit about the clarinet's development as a whole, so we have a little bit of context, and then we'll talk about the thumb rest itself. So we'll kind of go a little bit quicker through this section because we lost some time. So the predecessor of the clarinet was the chalumeau, kind of like a recorder with a single reed, just generally. And those two keys at the top were called speaker keys, but they really predated what we now know as a register key. It was really a folk instrument and would only really be used in art music to kind of represent pastoral or love scenes, and would be used by like Gluck or Telemann or Leopold Mozart, so it was an older instrument. And so the clarinet that emerged around 1690 really had the advantage of having offset speaker keys and jumping into that register that we call the clarion register. And so it got adopted into the art music scene a lot faster. And you'll notice that their timelines definitely overlap. So composers were using the clarinet for the top register and the chalumeau for the bottom register at the same time, and they would often play together for a little bit. And then the clarinet continued to develop and surpassed that. Whoops. So let's talk about that clarinet development that kind of got it into the art music scene permanently. So I think that it kind of happens in three stages. The first was about 100 years long, and the goal from about 1700 to 1800 was really about facilitating that upper register by fixing the bore, and then increasing chromatic possibilities by adding more tone holes and keys. So that was the general theme. And by the 1770s, you had a 5-key clarinet called a classical clarinet, and it was super widespread. They made it even into the century after that. So then the next was a really generally accelerated period of development that happened in 50 years, in which the growth really kind of was circular between instrument makers and composers and then clarinetists, and they would always kind of circle and challenge each other to make more complex music as well as instruments that could meet those demands. So from about 1800 to 1840, you saw a lot more addition of keys. You saw, what did you see? You saw, I'm trying to fix my screen here. You saw thickened instrument walls so you could drill more. The pads were reinvented. The mouthpieces were getting better. So really this giant step forward for the instrument. And lastly, about 1843 was a third stage where the BAME system clarinet, modeled after the Bohm flute or BAME flute, with ring keys and all the kind of complicated key work that we have today, kind of made a last bookend for the development until now. Okay. So this is these are some visual examples of different clarinets from the stages. You'll see all the way on the left is one of those original clarinets, very much still like a recorder. As you go through the second picture, you see a couple pinky keys there on the bottom. By the the early 1800s in that third picture, they're starting to look a little bit more like what we recognize. And then by the 1860s, definitely instruments that we could all play on easily if we were given them today. But where's the thumb rest in all of that? This is really well documented, all of these, and you can find lots of books that will show key by key and tone hole by tone hole exactly how the clarinet developed, but almost nothing is talked about how the instruments were supported and held, or what the right-hand thumbs were doing, or anything like that. So I kind of went back through and talked to some historians and did some reading and kind of guesswork to come up with an idea of what happened. So let's go back and understand that the really early clarinets were completely unstandardized. Now we just get a clarinet and it's exactly like the one that our friend just got. But back then, everything was custom and different. And right at the beginning, either hand could be played at the bottom even. So you can imagine, you get an instrument and you don't even know where to put your hands. That's what it was like to play clarinet at first. So the shift to the right hand maybe happened in the late 1700s, and they started talking about putting the right hand on the bottom in texts. As early as 1738, that was the first kind of instruction to do that. But also as late as 1821, right before the BAME system came out, they were still telling people, hey, you should use the right hand on the bottom, which kind of suggests that maybe people weren't sure still, and that it really was worth reconfirming. And so there was no thumb rest, so either hand could go on the bottom, and at first they even had tone holes that could, on the bell, that could just be rotated. So you could play it with your right pinky, or you can move it and play it with your left. So, and even the additional keys for the thumbs were put directly beneath the thumbs, so you could get to it with either hand. So the instruments themselves actually lent themselves to this kind of customization depending on what you felt like doing. So the instrument that as instrument makers continued to experiment with those tone holes and adding keys, the instrument that we recognize as the clarinet started to take shape. And so there were two main factors that led to the addition of the thumb rest. The first driving factor was the additional key work. And when keys are depressed, they act like long levers and really move the instrument. And so you really need something to help stabilize the position of the instrument. This man, Yvan Muller, was a really great clarinetist, but an even better inventor. And he kept on continually reinventing the clarinet and adding more and more and more. So he added things like the external speaker pipe. He invented what we would consider modern key pads with felt that would close the holes. He drilled countersunk tone holes so they're beneath the outside bore. He invented the pillars that we attach the keys to, so he really helped design the instrument as we know it. What he did was he eliminated those bottom thumb keys, and he added a thumb rest. So he was one of the first people pushing for this idea that the thumb really should be freed up and only in a supportive role. And while his initial instrument from the 1820s was really looked down upon by the Paris Conservatory, it eventually spread throughout Europe widely, and so it really propagated this idea that the right-hand thumb should be on the bottom with a thumb rest. So let's look at some early thumb rests. There are two kinds. So the carved out sections or protrusions of the clarinet body itself were called integral thumb rests. It was integral to the body. So if you can imagine the bottom of your clarinet having a big bump of wood, that would be kind of a thumb rest or something to grip onto. The things that we use today or they used back in the 1800s were non-integral rests or anything just attached onto the instrument. And this is a really beautiful example of a mother of pearl kind of scooped out section that was added to the clarinet that you could grip on. So it wasn't necessarily a little metal attachment at first, it was just something to hold onto the clarinet. Okay, so we talked about that first driving factor of key work towards the thumb rest. So then the second factor that really sealed the deal for the thumb rest sticking around was the weight of the instrument. So as you add keys, you're obviously getting a little bit extra weight for the key work, but really what you need is a type of wood that will withstand all that drilling that you're going to do with all the tone holes and keyworks and posts and thumb rests that you're adding. And the boxwood and rosewood that they were using wasn't up to that task. So they switched to grenadilla wood or impingo wood, something that really was dense and could be abused in the manufacturing process, so all this extra stuff could be put onto it. And you'll see here really how much actually is happening underneath that key work. So that led to the instruments being about twice as heavy as they were before with those other woods. So if you can imagine the soprano clarinet's about 2 pounds, it would be really great if it only weighed 1 pound, right? Our thumbs would probably feel a lot happier. So we had all these extra things to do with our pinkies and hands, and we needed to balance it. And then also, because of the manufacturing process, we had this heavier instrument. And so those are the two main reasons that we got those thumb rests and that they stayed forever. Okay. So, as a classroom of clarinetists, I don't really need to justify to you why this research that I did was important. Obviously, many people struggle with wrist problems or thumb problems. Raise your hand if when you were starting as a clarinetist, your thumb would hurt. Right? Do you remember those like red marks on your thumb and it was the worst? Right? So it never goes away for some people. They always are struggling with how to support the instrument in a way that feels natural or that's balanced. Okay, so when we talk about musician injury, there's kind of 3 categories that doctors use to divide their patients. The first one is musculoskeletal, anything to do with your joints or your muscles, and that's what most people have injuries in. That's the majority of injuries, and we'll talk about that further. There's also nerve entrapments like carpal tunnel, where your nerves aren't moving properly, and dystonias, which are considered to be neurological problems. And so doctors take those 3 categories and then they look at where the problem actually is. And what they find is that they're lateralized, meaning to one side of the body or another. And so wind players have all their injuries lateralized to the side of the body that supports the instrument. So twice as many people are seen for right arm pain than left. So everybody's having this problem with supporting the instrument. And you guys can go find out a little bit more about this by looking at some of the reviews of injured players that are out there. People have looked at orchestras and music schools and medical treatment centers, and all of them contribute that holding up the instrument is not helping anyone and it's injuring most of them. Okay, so that's kind of the medical background for why we want to do this study. So clarinetists obviously know this, and we try and help ourselves before we get injured in a couple different ways, right? We try neck straps or other kind of supportive features. We have begun on this kind of big adventure of trying to change the thumb rest itself. Some of you might even have one of these, the Kuiman. There's all sorts of different options. And then the by far most common that probably you all have now just coming on any instrument that you buy from a manufacturer is these adjustable thumb rests. And that first happened in about 1975 on the buffet, like professional model clarinets. That was the first time that they kind of hit the market. And now if you go to any of the festivals, you'll see every single brand has adjustable thumb rests on their clarinet. It's just assumed that that's either A, what the customer wants, or B, what's best for people. The problem with that, though, is that there's no rules, right? Nobody gives you an instruction manual on how to use that thumb rest. It moves your thumb up and down, but nobody says, if you have a big hand, this is what you should do, or if you have a small hand, that's what you should do. So the kind of juxtaposition of the medical information of everyone getting injured, plus my experience as a clarinetist and just a frustration with the fact that there were no guides out there to help with this, meant that I was really in good shape for coming up with a study that could look at clarinetists and what they do with their thumbs and muscles. So the research questions were, what happens at the muscular level during clarinet playing? Does our thumb rest position actually influence muscle use? And does our hand size or experience level influence that muscle use at all either? Okay. So I took 20 clarinetists and divided them into university students and professionals that work professionally as players. And then also kind of divided them into subgroups based on their small or large hand sizes. We took muscle recordings, and I'm going to go over exactly how that works in 1 second. And then obviously we did some statistical analysis, and we can kind of gloss over that because ANOVAs are not that interesting. No one likes stats. Okay, so we'll talk later. Okay, so electromyography is just simply a way to use the surface of the skin to measure the electrical signals that are going to your muscles. And it is a reflection of how hard that they are working. So a stronger EMG signal means that your muscle is sending lots of electrical recruitment signals and making the muscles kind of burst more. So you can see your spinal cord or your central nervous system is sending an electrical message to your muscle, and this little electrode gives us a signal that then we can kind of interpret into how hard the muscles are working. Any questions on this? I just want to make sure that people get the premise. Okay, great. Okay, so we looked at muscles all throughout the arm. We're going to actually go through these on yourself, so find a buddy or get comfortable with your own arm. So take your right arm. We're going to go through it. We wanted to get a chain of support. So let's start at the top and work down to the harder ones. The tricep, go like a hammer down. Right, so our tricep, and then do a big bicep curl. We don't have big biceps because we're clarinetists. We don't hit the gym that much. Okay, so those two muscles are doing exactly what I'm showing you. They work on the forearm at the elbow joint, and so they control that kind of stabilizing that we do. The next one is the brachioradialis. And so if you pretend like you're riding a motorcycle and you're super cool and you go boom, boom, that's what it's doing. So and actually this muscle is one that I brought up into this study because this one always hurts. If you find you'll feel it up at your forearm, the top of your forearm. It hurts a lot for clarinet players. It's just kind of sore and it feels good to get a massage there. Okay, so that's another one that's stabilizing the elbow. Now we're going to look at the wrist stabilizing muscles, the extensor and flexor. So go put your hand out straight and then go to one wall and then go to the other wall. Right. So that's what there are two muscles that kind of create that opposite motion. The other ones that they also do are knocking on the door. Right? So there are two muscles that really help with both directions there. And so they obviously help us when we're stabilizing the clarinet and not totally dropping our wrist. Now we're going to get into the thumb muscles. Clarinetists have really nice thumb muscles, as we found out. So they have really well-defined thumb muscles. So there should be like a calendar of like thumb muscles. Okay. So hold your thumb out like this, flat, and now lift it up. Okay, so now what you're going to do while you kind of wiggle back and forth, you're going to try and feel on your wrist, straight back. You should feel a little bit of wiggling as you lift up to the ceiling. A little hard one. Does anybody feel it? Wiggling? So that's actually the muscle that inserts on your thumb and wraps around your wrist and holds up the thumb against the thumb rest. So if you feel like sore in your wrist, that's because you're working to raise your thumb up. Now let's look at two last ones. The really meaty one here, this is called the abductor pollicis brevis, or APB. This is where we totally shine, have awesome hand, and it is what brings your thumb to your pinky. Right, feel that working? Good, so that's a super important one for us. Okay, and then the last one is kind of for the first finger, the index finger, and kind of for the thumb. And it really helps us stabilize our thumb and make sure that it doesn't just fall down completely. And that's called our FDI. If you squeeze your thumb together, it's right here. And this is where we really have really meaty muscles. muscles. If you go and ask like your violin friends to show them your right hand, their bow hand, they probably will not have this like extremely well-developed first dorsal interosseous muscle. Okay, everyone kind of, yeah, like super, okay. Okay, so we're going to actually see a picture of somebody with the electrodes on them in just a second once I talk about the test. So you'll get an idea of how we actually specifically got those points. So then we had the muscles we wanted to record. The next thing that we needed to do was create conditions to study the thumb rest. So what I did is I used an extra long adjustable thumb rest from Luis Rossi, who's a clarinet maker in Chile. He sent me one, which was super nice. So he sent me this, and I attached it to the clarinet. So for the really low extension, I even added some cork to the bottom. That would be like putting your thumb across from your ring finger. Very low, super uncomfortable for most people. The traditional one put that thumb kind of between your index and middle finger in a position that would most likely be one of those old thumb rests that weren't adjustable yet, or the bottom of an adjustable. And then the last but not least, the high one, this kind of simulates using an adjustable thumb rest, so popping that thumb up to be across from that first finger and a pinch. So people have different opinions about these positions, but nobody knows what it actually does. So then, last but not least, the tasks. So we had them hold 10 notes, just totally stable. And then we had them do some cloche exercises. I can pull those up later if you're curious. And then we had them do those same held notes again just to see if they had gotten fatigued or if their muscles looked different afterwards. And so then that was a kind of task block, and they played them on the traditional, the high, and the low thumb rest, so we could get a good reading of what exactly was happening. It helped to be a clarinetist because I could pick exercises that would isolate certain elements. So either crossing the register break, or right hand pinky low notes, or thirds, and we did scales. So each of the tasks kind of represented something that we could isolate. Okay, so at this moment, what I want to do is show you an example of somebody completing the task. It took about half an hour to set them up with all the electrodes, and then another hour to do the whole experiment. Okay, great. He did great. So that would be one of the trials. They did multiple trials of the same thing, so we could kind of make sure we always got a good trial for each example. Okay. So that's how the experiment was set up. We thought that that would cover all our bases. And this is what that electrical signal out of the muscles looked like. And this popped up right on our screen. We could immediately see that there are a couple patterns that happen. You see on the triceps and biceps, they're pretty consistently active the whole way across. And we called that like a sustaining or a holding pattern. And then there's a bursting pattern, or something that is changing over time. You can see that big meaty thumb flexor that we have. It's really nicely bursting.
Like how so? Like contracting and.
Yeah, very slightly contracting, which is interesting because I did not expect that muscle to be bursting at all. I thought it would be locked and set and look just like the tricep muscle, where it's just holding the elbow. We're going to definitely dive into what these different patterns mean. So how I'm going to represent that, rather than only use these raw muscle patterns, we're going to represent them as an average. And so each point along this circle represents the average muscle activity, and each of the spokes on the circle represents the task that they were doing. So either the 10 held notes or the 10 exercises. And so what this allows us to do is see how that muscle signal changed over the course of the different activities. In this example, that thumb flexor again, you can see that at 10, it's further out along the circle. So the amplitude or the amount it was working is higher. So the further out you get on the circle, the more the muscle's working. The more it is towards the center means it's not working very much at all. Okay, and so if you plot all 8 muscles together for the tasks and the exercises, this is what it looks like. And I'm going to isolate it for you so it's not just like a rainbow explosion. So here are the muscles that worked on our elbow, the big ones. For the held notes, you can see they're pretty circular. So they were using the same amount of activity almost the entire time for each of the different exercises. For the held notes, the exercises use that brachioradialis. It was a little bit more variable, right? It was the one that was our motorcycle movement. And so when we rotate our wrist to get to certain keys, that brachioradialis really jumps up and might use more activity, whereas in other activities like 4 or 5 that were left-handed activities, it wasn't working at all because it was stable. These are the muscles that act on the thumb and the wrist. And you can see generally, just categorically, they're a little bit more variable overall. The big muscles at the top of the arm are much more stable and round, and then these ones are super variable based on the task. And I want to point out, now that you've had a second to kind of look at it, if you look at the axis of exercises, you'll see that there's kind of a stretching along this 2 to 7. And that stretching means that, again, the muscles are further out or more active. So I wanted to see, okay, what were those exercises doing? Why are all the muscles a little bit harder, working harder? And it's because that both of those involve large leaps and really low right hand, low E. So we'll come back to this, but already certain tasks were making the muscles work a lot harder than the others. Okay, and that's all of them back together. So we saw here that, just as a brief summary, the tasks themselves made the muscles act different. So that's the general theme. So now let's go to that thumb rest position question. The way that I have it here is there is a line for all of my 20 participants. So this is just the general trend of all the participants. And what it's showing is, as you move the thumb rest from a low to high position, the muscle activation is going down. So again, I'll say that again. As the thumb moves higher, it's working less. Now, it's funny because then the thumb extensor on this bottom one, as it moves higher, it's getting less and less happy. It's having to lift up towards the ceiling, right? So the thumb muscles are kind of opposite each other. And we would expect that. One goes in one direction, the other one is not happy, you move in the other direction, and that relationship switches. Yeah?
So it sounds like there's sort of an inverse relationship there. What's the one, which muscle is at 14 at the high end? Which muscle is that?
I'm sorry, which side?
On the left side.
Right, yeah, so let me clarify that. That's great.
Yeah.
So this is each of these graphs represents one muscle and all the subjects, how they used that muscle.
Okay.
So I switched no, that's okay. I switched the presentation style.
I missed this. What was your survey of subjects? Is it like people with varying ranges of ability and experience?
Yeah, just 2 categories, university level students and professionals. And this is both of them. So it's you can see that the trend is for both professionals and students. I'm going to do a lot of summarizing and making sure that you guys get the take-home point for sure. So those are the thumb flexors. And then the wrist extensor and flexor, the ones that went sideways or knocked, they both, it's a little bit harder to see, but they are both coming at a slant this way. So they used less muscle activation as you went higher. And in this one, you can see the wrist flexor, it's a little bit more variable, right? Not everybody fits into that trend that the statistics told me was there. So we're going to come back to that. It's variable, and that's okay. Everybody's a little bit different, and I'm going to talk about what that means for deciding about your own thumb rest. So as a reminder, we have those 2 thumb muscles and the 2 wrist muscles. 3 of them are lowered in activation as you raise the thumb rest, and that 1 thumb extensor is not. Okay. So last but not least, we looked at hand size and experience level. So we looked at task, thumb rest already. Now let's look at some of the things that you personally have, like your hands. Okay. So there was a main effect, meaning a statistical effect on muscle activity only for the triceps. And that's that left one. So it was weird. People with large hands actually used more of their triceps than the small-handed people, which was the exception because all of the other muscles, like this wrist flexor that I included, all the other muscles, the small-handed or the solid line, were outside or at a higher level than big-handed people. And so definitely the take-home was that almost every single one of your muscles, if you have small hands, is working harder than the guy next to you that is a foot taller than you. Right. So people that have small hands are definitely using more muscle activity to accomplish the same tasks. Let's look at experience level. So there was a main effect. The biggest difference was in this thumb muscle here, and students across the board always play with more muscle activity than professionals. And oftentimes my professionals and students were not that many years apart. It can just be a couple years, but they're using less muscle activity as they play professionally and are getting into that next level of having a job or teaching. And so here are some other examples of the experience level for other muscles. You can see always that that student line is a little bit outside of that professional line. Okay, so let's go through the results and we'll take a couple questions before we go into the next section. So we saw that the task really influenced the way that we use our muscles, and that's not how we traditionally get taught the clarinet, right? We're taught, like, put your thumb there, and then just wiggle your fingers, and don't think about the different notes that you're playing. Just play everything the same way. But that's not really true. As you play different notes or different sequences of notes, the entire chain of your arm, including your thumb that's right next to the thumb rest, is making slight adjustments. Next, the thumb rest. So we saw that definitely it makes a significant difference where your thumb is on your instrument, and that for most people, it's going to be better to raise your thumb rest. We also saw that there was a little bit of individual variability, so it's not for every single person. And so we're going to talk about that at the end. We saw that small hands play with more muscle activity, sadly. And also, I just want to say, it's not necessarily just small people. Also think about just students and little kids that are trying to learn on big instruments. They're really struggling with how much muscle activity they're using. And then we also saw that students, just in general, are using more activation than professionals. So let's kind of go through. With the task, pedagogically, again, they vary the muscle involvement based on the task. So we know that left hand exercises really don't strain the muscles very much, and right hand ones do. So when you're a teacher, make sure that you take extra special care of showing them the right-handed exercises and stretching to those pinky notes and making sure that they're not overworking. I think that it actually confirmed the kind of method that Professor DeLutis uses of the Weber warm-up. You want to really make sure that there's time in a student's day, every single day, to work on technique and make sure that they're using their hands correctly. You don't want that to be forgotten and just only work on repertoire. You need to focus on making sure that they can master each of these tasks because they're different and they change the way that we use our arm. Again, injury prevention, pinkies definitely cause the most activation for that right arm. So if you have an injury, try and find a way to use those left-hand pinkies, right? Take a little bit of the strain off your right, or just try and avoid them for a little bit. If you're trying to do warm-ups that are gentle and easy, don't use your pinkies. So the thumb rest position, definitely consider moving the thumb rest up. It definitely could reduce the strain on your forearm muscles and possibly reduce overuse injuries if you're prone to them. But keep in mind that it does raise the activation for that one thumb muscle. So if you do it, make sure that you're monitoring that and that it's not going to cause another injury for that one muscle that lifts up the thumb. This effect was seen regardless of hand size or experience level. Remember, we had all the subjects showing that same trend. So it doesn't mean that I can say all my students need to be on high thumb rests, and then when they get bigger, I'm going to put them down to lower ones. So it's not kind of a prescription. It means that everyone should probably benefit from moving it up, and that there might be some exceptions in there. Hand size. This experiment really made me think a lot harder about why we put little kids on instruments that like 6-foot players play on. I'm doing another study soon that I hope will advocate for starting little kids, like 5th graders, on E-flat clarinets. I think that it could be a really good financial opportunity for companies to make instruments that are smaller. Just like we have 7/8 violins or 3/4 violins and little versions of all the string instruments, I think that there could be a better way to teach our own wind beginners to use their hands properly and not be stretching and overworking and learning that that's what it takes to play the instrument. Probably a lot of you spend a lot of time in your lessons unlearning how hard to push on the clarinet. And you got that because you started on something that was this big. Okay, we looked at smaller hands activate more muscle and are probably at a higher risk for musculoskeletal injury. So if you are a person with small hands, take preventive measures. Make sure that you're stretching. Don't overwork. Ice your arms. Consider other support systems like neck straps might be even more important for you. And again, it had no influence on the thumb rest, so it's not automatically going to help. So with the experience level, pedagogically, we know now that even university students, even though they may be starting to get professional gigs, they generally are more variable in their muscle use. And so that's really the time when you guys are in college to really perfect that kind of overuse of your muscle to get to that next professional level. That's really what defines the two. Okay. I'm going to skip because of time. So, right, I found this is one of many options for bad clarinet technique on the internet. So, you guys probably know that either you're going to be ed majors and you're going to have a beginning band, or if you're any kind of professional, you're definitely going to teach. I do all the way from elementary schools to college kids. And so some of this has kind of already started working into my own teaching and just how I talk to kids about using their bodies. Okay, so don't ignore this in young students. I had a kid that came to me in 6th grade. His name is Joel. He couldn't hold the clarinet and he couldn't play a low G. His hands just would not cover the tone holes. They're too little. And so what I would have to do is put my instrument case on the floor so the bell of the instrument would be under his clarinet. Or, I'm sorry, the bell of the instrument could rest on my case so it could just kind of sit there and he could kind of learn. And now Joel is like this big 3 years later. He's super tall, has enormous, like, giant man hands, and it's not a problem. But it was really important to me while we were learning on that instrument that was way too big for him to talk about making sure that you're using your hand properly and that they're envisioning what's going to happen as they grow on the instrument. You also want to instruct your kids on body awareness. If all of your beginning clarinet kids are like this, try and address it. That's going to impinge all their nerves and obviously isn't going to help them breathe. So just gently say, hey guys, long necks, and just general friendly things to start getting them into a proper body habit. So by the time that they may get to high school or college, they're not undoing years of really terrible body habits. Okay, so for further research, just for your own education and potential research opportunities, there's all sorts of medical journals that want people to look at musicians. And there's really only these 3 studies and the one that hopefully I have coming out. So if you are interested in this at all, there's a ton of space for you to get involved and do an interdepartmental kind of project that could really raise your own profile as an academic. So there's an oboe force study that looks at how much force goes onto your thumb. There's a joint angle study from Arizona that kind of looks at movement and whether or not we play with the pedagogical like C or something else. And she found that we don't really follow those pedagogical models. And then there's one that talks about a neck strap. So that's it. If you have another idea, you should do it. These are some of the research ideas that I thought could come directly out of this. You could look at the muscles on your neck. You could look at those other thumb rest models and see if they actually change anything. You could apply this to oboists and saxophonists that also have that same exact kind of problem of supporting the instrument. You could study injured players. We only did healthy people. And then this next one is one that I just started last week. We're going to combine motion data and muscle data to look at the differences of playing the 3 different main family members of the clarinet family and what that actually does in terms of our movement and what that requires, and also just the muscle involvement with holding different positions and playing. I also think that people should study instrument modifications, like Wolfgang was just here. He does a lot of the specialty kind of key work that some people require, and so I think that that's probably a really great trend and that more research on that would bring light to it. That's nothing. So those are some of the references if you're ever curious about where to read about some of these medical people that are interested in music. Okay, that's my collaborator, Sarah Winges, and then obviously she's in the School of Kinesiology, and thank you guys. So that's it.